Hi, my name is Olivia with the Elkhart County Historical Museum, and welcome to a brand new YouTube series where I make and eat recipes that I found in our archive. Today's recipe is for something called hermits, also known as hermit bars or hermit cookies. This is your classic chewy cookie recipe, but with a few twists. The first is that this cookie is eerily reminiscent of a fruitcake. The recipe we're using here today includes mixed nuts and raisins, but other recipes I've looked at included any kind of dried fruit, crystallized ginger, anything you might find in a fruitcake recipe. The second twist is that rather than cutting these out with cookie cutters or rolling the dough out into balls beforehand, these cookies are baked in one giant sheet and cut into bars afterwards. So the first thing we're going to do is combine all of our dry ingredients. We're going to use 3 cups of flour, 2 teaspoons of cinnamon, and 2 teaspoons of allspice. And while I work on combining these, I'll tell you a little bit about the history behind this version of the recipe. This recipe was found in the William Probosco collection in our archive. Unfortunately, we don't know the origins of all the recipes in this collection. We mostly just know that they were created between 1920 and 1950. The recipes themselves are a mix of cutouts from newspapers and handwritten notes. One is even scribbled on the back of an envelope. This recipe in particular, simply titled Hermits, was handwritten and signed by an Anna Day. So now that I've added in the flour, cinnamon, and allspice, I'm also going to add a little bit of salt. This is not included in the actual recipe, but since I'm using unsalted butter, I've decided to include a little bit, since I'm assuming our author probably used the salted version. Now, a little bit more context on Anna. I was unable to track down any more information about Anna within our own archives or our photo collections. However, I was able to find a census record that appears to be the Anna in question. So, I'll tell you a little bit about her history. This Anna was born in 1884 to John and Olivia Johnson. So after I combine these wet ingredients, I'll tell you a little bit more about Anna and continue her story. So for the wet ingredients, we're going to start by mixing 2 cups of brown sugar with 3/4 cup of melted butter. Then after this is well combined, then we're going to add 3 eggs. So as I do this, I'll tell you a little bit more about Anna. So she was born in 1884 to John and Olivia Johnson, as I mentioned before. And she would go on to marry a man named John Day. And by 1919, she would have a daughter of her own that she would name Olivia, likely after her mother, Olivia Johnson. Well, this is certainly not the end of Anna's story, and I encourage any gifted researchers to look for more records of her life. This was all that was available through the census records. Hopefully, this recipe is a little bit of a window into Anna's story and Anna's life. The one thing we do know is that at some point Anna thought about or maybe made this recipe. What she didn't do is leave us any kind of instructions on how to make it, so I've come up with those by looking at other recipes for hermit bars. So this next step is not something I typically do in my recipes, but Anna's recipe calls for us to dissolve 2 teaspoons of baking soda in 2 tablespoons of water. So instead of including this baking soda in the dry ingredients, I'm going to go ahead and include it with the eggs, butter, and sugar. So I'm going to go ahead and combine that in here now. And then after this, we're going to work on mixing in the dry ingredients. Now that all of our wet ingredients are combined well, we're going to go ahead and mix in our dry ingredients slowly, just a little bit at a time. And while I finish up doing this, I'll tell you a little bit more context on the hermit cookies themselves. So one thing that I find super interesting about these cookies or bars is that the origin of the name is unclear. Although many people attribute it to the idea that the flavors of the cookie improve when they are left alone and allowed to sit for a few days before eating, we're not really sure if that's actually the reason behind the name. However, because these cookies keep well, as I mentioned before, they're ideal for sailors and soldiers, and I found at least one story of these cookies winding up in a mother's 1942 care package to her son while he was training at Army camp. So now we're getting close to the final stages of this recipe, and we have our dough somewhat together. So now we're going to go ahead and add 1 cup of nuts and 1 cup of raisins. I opted for mixed nuts, but the recipe does not specify, so feel free if you make this on your own to include any nuts of your preference. Okay, and now we're at the final step of our recipe. So what we're going to do is I'm going to press this dough into a greased jelly roll pan. And once it's spread out somewhat evenly, I'm going to go ahead and put it in the oven for 12 minutes at 375. Now, the recipe did not include any instructions for the cooking process, nor did it include a baking time or temperature, but this is about what I got when I looked at other recipes online. This was about the normal time to bake these cookies. I'm going to go ahead and put these in an oven at 375 for 12 minutes. All right, our timer's gone off, our cookies are ready. Go ahead and pull them out of the oven. They smell amazing. So we're gonna let these cool for a few minutes and then we'll go ahead and taste. All right, our Hermits have cooled, so let's give them a taste test. Pretty good. They definitely have a different texture than a regular cookie, but they have a nice flavor and I like the crunch from the nuts. Overall, definitely an 8 out of 10. If you liked this video, please subscribe to our YouTube page and keep watching as I'll make more recipes from our archives.